Anyway, the Baldwins set off to go in this other direction, and neither the reformers in Quebec or the reformers in Ontario really knew what to do. The rebellion happened, which was the end, I think, of the European model in some ways in Canada, because we tried the European way, the American way, and it failed. And you have 3 years of disorder and despair, and then out of that, a guy called Hinks, a kind of guy on the make, really smart, but not bad, but sort of corrupt, but, you know, interesting guy, has this idea and introduces LaFontaine and Baldwin. And so they're in their 30s. They meet in their 30s in 1840. They come to power after 8 really tough years in 1848. They're in power for 3 years, and in 3 years, they put 200, 300, 400 bills through that completely changed the face of Canada. Everything that works in this country, that legally works in this country, was put in place in those 3 years. And everybody else has been building on that foundation ever since. You know, municipal democracy, professional civil service, bilingualism, everything was done by them. And the most important thing was and we said we'd talk about this, was a different approach towards violence and non-violence.
Absolutely.
But the interesting thing about them is that they're really, really strange, interesting individuals. I mean, LaFontaine was always thought to be very cold and distant, but that's because he suddenly in his 30s got a terrible disease, which meant that he was writhing in pain half the time, couldn't even leave his house most of the time. And when he left, he did what a lot of people do in terrible pain. He just put a wall up like that. So he just hardly spoke, hardly moved. So everybody thought he was very distant and pompous, whereas in fact he was just holding himself together. The whole battle for democracy in Canada was led by a man who could hardly speak in public. He was in such pain. But he was so proud he would never show it. Yeah. And Baldwin was probably the greatest romantic we've ever had in public life. I mean, Sorrows of Young Werther, I mean, Heathcliff, I mean, Baldwin was a 100% romantic who wrote enormous amounts of not very good poetry, love poetry, to endless women.
You all disagree?
And eventually found, when he was in his, about 20, and she was about 16, I'm trying to remember now, found this first cousin, and the parents sent them apart. And after they wrote each other every day, they went out and they had it worked out that at the same hour, at certain nights of the month, they would go out. She was in New York and he was in Toronto. They would go out and they would speak to each other through the moon. And this is really amazing stuff. They were married the day, 2 or 3 days before she turned 18. They were married. She was dead at the age of 25 as a result of, I think, the 4th child birth, the cesarean infection, awfulness, spent a year dying, and he never recovered mentally.
And then you showed me the amazing will. So
this is the greatest love story of public life of any Western country I know. He never got over her. Her bedroom was turned into a chapel, essentially. Nobody was allowed into the room. And he carried around with him, it's back there in the case, animal vellum piece about this big, folded up in 8, I think, on which he wrote the instructions for his funeral, just in case he died when he was away. And the instructions for his funeral were that he was to be laid out with all of the love letters on his chest. He wrote out himself copies of all the love letters that he gave to the children because he believed that there was no greater love story than his. So they had to realize how inferior they eventually were. You know? But it really was not a nice thing to do. Anyway, and you know, the handkerchief that was put over her face when she died was put over his face. There's a locket that was put here. There are all these things that were put all over him, put in a casket beside her casket, chained together. But the most important thing was the detailed instructions that before he was put in the casket, they were to carry out on him a cesarean. And they did everything except that. And there was a state funeral You know, these two men, Laffontaine and Baldwin, they both had state funerals, and the whole of Toronto was shut down. It was in January, and about a month after the funeral, one of the sons came home and discovered the piece of vellum in one of his waistcoat pockets, I think, and took it out and immediately called his Baldwin's brother-in-law and the doctor, and they went out to the tomb and they unchained it and they took him out of the casket and they undressed him and they carried out the cesarean and put it all back together again. And this is Canadian boring history. This is the father of Canadian democracy, a man walking against suffering every day and yet, you know, courageous in doing it, and another man overwhelmed, weeping in public all the time because of this enormous love that he had for his dead wife. And somewhere in the room, and then I'm going to stop doing this, the book is dedicated to 4 historians, and one of them, Robert Fraser, is here somewhere, isn't he? Is Robert here? There's Robert Fraser. And Robert Fraser and Michael Cross are the 2 people who did the really fantastic research to uncover just how interesting and complicated Baldwin was. And there's a guy called Eric Bedard in Montreal who's just done amazing work on Lafontaine. Anyway.
Here's a question I want to ask you. I say I both was surprised but not that you chose, and I want to see if one of the reasons I wasn't surprised that you chose Lafontaine and Baldwin was because I think that with young Canadians, the fear is that these men are quickly fading from these young people's histories, that young people don't know about them. And is this one of the reasons you...
Yeah, but I think that, I think that the wonderful thing about Riel is that his star has got higher and higher, you know, and now you go to Manitoba and he's the founder of Manitoba. His statue, it's not the statue of any of the people who hated him. He's the founder of Manitoba, and the Orange Order was defeated essentially by history. Dumont, it was so wonderful to put Dumont in because Dumont was left out. Yeah. And he's really, in a way, the representation of that attachment to the land, I think.
No, absolutely.
So I think that brings Dumont back. Lafontaine and Baldwin, there's just this, in order to understand ourselves, we have to understand these kind of people. And I felt they had to be in the series because they are the founders of, you know, if you look at someone like René Lévesque is a direct outcome of Lafontaine and Baldwin. Lester Pearson is a direct outcome. Trudeau, in spite of a few mistakes, is a direct outcome.
But is there any fear with...
Well, you know, there's a few his reaction to the October crisis is not the reaction that Lafontaine and Baldwin would have had.
No.
It's the opposite of... If you look at the way they handled the riots of 1849, it's the exact opposite of what Trudeau did. So I have to say that.
But do you worry that young Canadians, and I'm speaking of those of us, say, 43 or younger, are... that they don't play as big a role. They don't play as big a role as they should. That they're not as well known as they once were.
Yes, we all know that there's a big problem with the teaching of history in Canada, but it's not just the teaching of history. It's how do you talk myth in a country where the most popular means of myth making are not ours? Yeah. You know, films and television, and it's quite complicated when, you know, people can just turn on and they'll be inundated with descriptions of the D-Day landings, in which there were only 4 beaches, right? There wasn't a 5th beach, right? There were 2 American beaches and 2 British beaches. There was no Canadian beach. It's a complete figment of your imagination, right? Because you've seen British films and French films and American films. There's no Canadian beach, right? So it is difficult to... when you have empires, and worse than that, bitter ex-empires, eager to show that they're really important, it's very hard to keep telling your story and to have it heard. I mean, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, and there's this really kind of knee-jerk reaction amongst some people right now that Canadian history is, well, it's not just now, it's been forever, that Canadian history is boring, that it's not American history, that we've been overwhelmed by American history and all the John Wayne representations of it.